Hello, everyone, and welcome to the ScaledOn Sessions. I'm Courtney, ScaledOn's Director of Marketing, and today is for anyone who is responsible for filling seats, particularly at a university or continuing education program. I brought two people with me today who see this from both sides. First, joining me is our founder, Alec, who spends his time where marketing and AI are heading and teaches exactly that and how AI is changing marketing in various courses at New England universities and continuing ed programs. So the shift that we're going to talk about today is one that he's teaching to schools like yours. And our lead SEO strategist, Adrian, is joining me as well. Adrian lives and breathes in how search and AI actually decide how schools get found on a daily basis. So I know the combination of their knowledge and insight is going to be valuable to everyone joining us today. To kind of kick us off and talk a little bit about things, I think there's two tracks that we wanted to talk about today. Schools ask, do we show up when students use AI? Which is a great question, and obviously the primary question that schools talk about. But there are two ways to lose. One is not being in the answer. And I think two is the one that gets talked about a little less, which is maybe you're in the answer, but it's wrong or it's not how you really want to be showing up. So I think today we're going to cover both. We're going to lean probably a little bit more heavily on how to show up. But we're going to talk about both and some insights on what schools can do, to increase their AI visibility. The team is live in the chat, so please do drop questions as you're joining us and you have them. Drop questions in the chat. If you're watching the premiere, the team is live in the chat. If you're catching the replay, we are still available to help you with any questions that you have. You can reach out to us on scaledon.com. And we always like to leave you with a little gift. So at the conclusion of the session, there will be an AI enrollment visibility snapshot, a link to that you can fill out so that you can see the 5 questions and the biggest gaps that your program has with those questions in your AI visibility. So jumping in, that's a little bit of our housekeeping piece there. Jumping in, set the scene for me, guys. How are students actually finding schools now, and what happens when you're not in that picture?
Yeah, I think it's a really great question. So the nice thing, for all universities, right? Whether you're, a small community college to, a huge, right, maybe multi-campus institution, is typically you show up pretty well in traditional SEO, right? For most folks, right? There's high domain authority, right? You've got a good brand presence that's there. I think what we're really going to talk about today is, students and parents are increasingly, and if you're on the continuing education side, definitely on the business side is, we've got, over 1 billion people using ChatGPT. That wasn't around a couple years ago. And so we have to evolve how we're showing up, where we're showing up. And before we just could show up in Google, right? Like, we sort of had one search engine for, the near last, we'll call it last 15, 20 years that we really could focus on in terms of, hey, we ran a marketing campaign. It went through the lens of Google. Are we showing up? Are we not showing up? Today, it's much more difficult, and I think Adrian can chat through this in detail with us. But guess what? There's ChatGPT, there's Google AI overviews, there's Perplexity, right? There's what's going on in Bing. There's a lot more places that you may want to be successfully showing up because the dominance of Google is no longer what it was.
Yeah, and I think, to put some statistics on that, right? Because the data, I think, is what tells the tale. We are seeing the EAB report that it jumped from 26% of high school students to 46% of high school students now removing a school from consideration based on what they're finding with AI. On the continuing ed and adult learner side, that percentage jumped from 3.5% to 19%. So that definitely is increasing. And then the other stat that I thought was really interesting is that the EAB is reporting that 80% of students are what they would call stealth researchers. They're researching anonymously with AI, and they're not filling out any sort of form or inquiry until they actually apply. Like they've made a decision and they're applying.
Well, and it makes a ton of sense, right? It makes a ton of sense that this is a huge decision if you're a student. Even if you're a continuing education student where, guess what? I don't have a lot of time. I'm going to use AI to go look at a couple of different programs. What's right for me, Here are my factors, right? And, Google traditionally hasn't done a great job of that, right? Where I might come in and say, hey, here's the 5 or 6 things that are really important to me. Help me understand it.
Yeah, I mean, definitely we see this in search behavior. Things are changing and are adapting. So, for example, if high school students didn't adopt AI search only 2 years ago, things are changing. And to Courtney's point, we are seeing is in the statistics. So, for example, almost half of the students are now researching like university options and higher education programs and comparing them in ChatGPTs, in Perplexities, in Geminis. So this is why it's actually important to show up there as a first condition.
Exactly. And I think, Pew has some really great data, but this is the primary way people are using AI, right, is to come back in and help them, with this sort of, I'll call it, maybe more nuanced search for information, right? Like it's not just, hey, where's the best place to have a movie or a meal? You know what I mean? Something that's very, Google does a phenomenal job with. It's coming back in, and we're seeing this also like in the medical area, right? I have a more complex problem, and guess what? I want that intelligence that AI brings to the table to help me in my decision.
So I think, showing up isn't necessarily the finish line, anymore now because it's part of a research process, right? So of course, showing up is important and getting in the AI answer as part of that research process is important. But I think one of the challenges that maybe is a little bit more unique with education programs, higher ed and continuing ed in particular, is you tend to have a lot of information in a lot of different places that changes very quickly. Your programs change, you offer a course and then you don't offer it anymore. Your rates change, like lots of different things change. And there's course catalogs, there's department pages, like there's all sorts of different things. There's print materials, right? So many different things. My son and daughter are looking at college. We get mailers we get mailers all the time, right? So how do you consolidate? Like, how do you make sure that when you're in the answer, it's correct? It's the answer you want to be giving. If you have stealth students doing this research, you want them to be seeing accurate information. Like, are there things that programs can do to, to make sure the right things that they want to be highlighted in AI are highlighted?
Yeah, so I think like Adrian will have a much deeper answer here, than I will, but I think it comes back fundamentally to information architecture, and sort of thinking about, we want to be in the service of those students, right? And often, at many institutions, guess what? There is various departments, there's business schools, there's all of these things that have gotten put out together. And they were not often organized and designed to be answering these AI questions, right? Like they're just not formatted right. So while the data may be there, and maybe there is a video on that page, it is often, not formatted for the AI to digest it. Right. And then we've had some institutions that are blocking AI altogether. Right. And so, because their IT department has come back and said, hey, you know what? We don't want Perplexity crawling you. You know what I mean? We may not, whatever the various engine is that they don't like. Hey, let's go block that. But guess what? If that is important to your continuing education or high school student, and they're using, let's call it roughly 44% of Americans are using ChatGPT, on a regular basis. That's a lot of students.
Yeah, definitely. And I want to add here that, for example, if you show up, then you have to ensure that you show up correctly. And there are actually a series of actions that you can take to show up correctly. So one of them would be to be fairly represented across all of the places that you are live on the web. So, for example, having the same information on the program page, on the category pages, or anything that you have that's even living outside of your website. So, for example, if you have a press release out, you want to ensure to have the same information in that press release to a specific program launch or to a program update or anything that's changing. So you have to have that consistency across all of these channels, across your website, across everything else that you publish. So this is the area that you have to control. But AI is also very good at picking up the way that you describe what you do. So you have to be descriptive about what you offer. When does the course begin? When does the enrollment date start? When does it end? So all of this information have to be accurate. So the key here is to be accurate, and to be accurate across all of the places that you are online.
Yeah, and I think, Adrian, it's a really good point, because often, and I'm going to give you a good example that I saw at an institution where they have the landing pages for their courses, you know what I mean, that they're doing, but it doesn't match what they're sending out in email. And because what they're sending out in email also has a web version, those things are out of sync. And you know, it's an unintentional fault, right? Where, you know, they've spent a lot of time building out all their course material, but guess what? The fresher stuff is going out potentially in the email. It doesn't match up exactly, but that email information is also getting crawled.
Absolutely. Well, this is a good opportunity to mention a practical exercise that anyone who's joining us today can do on their own. So if you want to get a feel for how this is for your programs yourself, try it later or now, whenever you have time, with a program that's a focus for your institution. So ask ChatGPT or the AI of your choosing what your program costs, how long it takes, whatever the questions are that you feel like your student or adult learner would be asking. And then hold up that answer that you get against your own program page and see where things may be off. And then the other opportunity that we'll offer with that is if you may be thinking, I don't have time to do this across all of our programs, I can't imagine what this takes. We're happy to do that heavy lifting for you. So that AI enrollment visibility snapshot that I referenced earlier can do that against your programs. But we can also do a deeper dive in what we call an opportunity review. So if you're hearing this and saying, hey, this sounds good, but I don't know where to begin and I don't have time to think about it, reach out to us. We can help with that. Start with the AI enrollment visibility snapshot, and we can go from there. But I think that's a good practical test for anybody to take. In our experience, and these guys know this better than anything else, most people are pretty surprised with what comes back.
Yeah, and I think the other part, just, you know, so that we're all on the same page with that, is that, you know, you could do that search and your boss or a colleague could do that search and they can get very different results. And that's because, you know, whether you're in Gemini and sort of, you know, the AI Max experience, guess what? That's been potentially customized to you, you know, so one of the things, one of the lenses that we have to think through in this, and this is why it becomes a more complicated piece, you know, and we are seeing a ton of questions on this, which is, the AI is, you know, it may have memory on for that person, right? It may, you know, it may have had some prior searches where it knows it's looking for universities in New England, you know, and so guess what? It's you know, shown a very different set of results because you've done some prior queries where in, you know, in sort of, I'll call it the traditional Google realm, there was less of that. You know, those things still existed, but there was less of that. And I think one of the big things, you know, that's happening is there's a really long tail here, you know, that you need to go after. And it's difficult because, you know, it's now ChatGPT plus Gemini plus Copilot, you know, and then for some younger audiences, they're using Meta AI, they're using Grok. They may be using, you know, a third of US households have some kind of voice capability, whether it's in their car, you know what I mean, or, you know, an Amazon Alexa speaker. You know, I know for my daughter, hey, I mean, Alexa is what she goes to, right? And it kills me. I mean, like I absolutely die on it because the answers are not that great, right? But that's what she turns to. And I think this is where you need to understand, you know, your business school audience might not be your continuing education audience, might not be that high school student.
Yeah, 100%. Listen, I have again, soon to be college students, and they're asking Siri a lot more than they're asking mom and dad. So, you know, that is definitely the way the pattern seems to be going. We have a lot of conversations here about what's your source.
But I think that's, you know, for the folks that are listening today, I think that's a really important thing is that what you've typed in may not be what your prospective students are seeing, right? And so this is why doing some kind of formal audit I think is a really important part, like getting some baseline data, and again, like all of these audits are imperfect, right? Like they are a snapshot in time, against these pieces, but I think it's something you want to measure. I think it's something that you want to look at and say, hey, am I happy about how I'm showing up? Because all too often, and I was doing this, with someone who runs a continuing education program recently. They were shocked at what they were showing up for. So their top 5 courses and subject matter by attendees, none of them, they were showing up for none of those things, and that was a shock to them.
Yeah, I think we see that a lot, where the programs that the institutions would want to be surfacing and showing up for are oftentimes newer ones that aren't yet, because they're not necessarily building the same foundation around them when they launch them to get them seen more quickly. Adrian, I'll toss this one to you. When you have a new program that is being launched, what would you recommend, to help get visibility on that, both with AI and traditional search, so that schools can do some things to try to prioritize, getting the eyeballs on the things that are the most important to them?
Yeah, I think that, it's very important for universities to be very clear about what they're offering. So they often tend to fall on the marketing language, or not necessarily talk about their program or their offering in the way that a prospective student will talk about it. So for example, a high school student typing into a long prompt like, what's the best med school near me, or what's the best pre-med program near me, is going to be a bit different than maybe how a university would describe it, or they would not even include this type of query or keyword in the text itself. So being descriptive, being accurate, but also feeding the bots, because like AI is all about reading and being efficient, the content on the page. So for example, if you want to be as efficient and to show up to as many AI search engines as possible, you would have to add your schemas, your structured data to your courses, to your programs, to your university, to your homepage. Start with the key pages and then move down to whatever else you're offering. So the way the structured data works is that it simply shows what the program is about, what you are offering, and how you are describing it to the bots, also to Google, but also to ChatGPT, to Gemini, to Perplexity, in a way that is much quicker and much more concise than a plain marketing language could ever be.
And I'll give another example, and I'm just going to pick on continuing education programs, Courtney, is I see a lot of continuing education programs spend a lot of time on LinkedIn content, but they totally don't do anything in YouTube. And we know that YouTube has a very high correlation with showing up, in any of these AI overviews, because it's seen as a definitive source. It's seen as probably a little more trustworthy, right? If you're putting a video together, and there's been some really great data showing the correlation between those two things. And so, I think we need to think about in this world is, okay, maybe before I was only in one channel, right? And this gets back to Adrian's point. Like if I'm going after high school students, I need to be in Meta. I need to be in Instagram, right? Like those sources are being picked up by AI. And then if I would argue, if you don't have the bandwidth to sort of do all the channels, I would focus on YouTube and making sure, so you've launched a new course. Did you put a YouTube short out there on it or not? And, and did that data match up exactly with what's on the course page? That's very important.
Yeah. Are there other things that you would recommend that I know today we're talking in general about higher ed and continuing ed. Do you see different paths that each should take? Like, are there different things that you would recommend each type of institution do?
I would. I think, I think for many institutions, right, that are going after the high school student, they want to get them on campus, right? They want to show them the student center and the sports fields and get the, get the feeling, right? Sort of get a taste of those pieces. And so, that can be very different for a continuing education program where the prospective student may never sit on campus, may not want to, stay on campus. They may not even be in the geographic area, right? You know what I mean? They may be an alumni.
Very true.
And guess what? So you're a New England institution and this person's in California, or the West, right? But because they have such affinity, they're taking those things. And so I think, that's different intent, right? And going, after also, I think, a different competitive set. I think most institutions are very cognizant of potentially, the institutions that they compete with for yield and enrollment. But I'm not sure that they're monitoring how they're showing up. So for example, how are you showing up in Meta? How are you showing up in Instagram? What is your share? Right. So for example, if you have an amazing environmental program, are you showing up to the degree that you want to in the platforms that you want to there? And I don't think a lot of institutions are measuring that today. And I think, the first piece is to say, okay, so we have a competitive set. How are we doing against that competitive set? Are we growing our share, or are we or is it shrinking? And, and who are we losing to? And I think in the conversations I've been involved with, folks are often surprised who they're losing to, and just because it wasn't in, like they had this, I'll call it, traditional set of competitors. And guess what? To see, maybe it's an online platform, maybe it's the University of Phoenix, maybe it's SNHU, right? There might be other folks where they've lost some share in the AI platforms.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is one of the things that, exactly to your point, just to kind of reinforce that, like, it requires looking at not only your messaging, but that competitive set, like all the things that you typically looked at when you were putting together, a marketing plan for your programs really need to be looked at with a new lens now that AI visibility surfaces things differently. That's a really good point about the competition, right? Like we often see on kind of the traditional SEO side that even when we are working on SEO for a program or a university, we see them say, hey, we think our competitors are this. And from a search perspective, their competitors are different. This does absolutely introduce a third field. So there's kind of like who you think your competitors are, who Google or traditional search thinks your competitors are. And now there's a third tier of who AI thinks your competitors are. So that's definitely an interesting thing to make sure that you're on top of when you're trying to determine where you're showing up, whether it's in traditional search or AI search.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that we should talk about, and again, it's an emerging trend, but I think the younger generations are very skeptical about AI. So they're using it. Let's be really clear. They're using it all the time, right? But they have a more negative perception of it, right? And so I think this is a piece that you have to sort of think about and work in, to your plan, which is, is okay. So there's this share question, right? But then there is like, well, what do I want them? So like I'm not happy with where I am in ChatGPT. Okay, I'm gonna go fix, I'm gonna go fix sort of my visibility problem in a particular platform. But then what do you want them to do to actually get to convert? You know what I mean? To that piece. And I think this is where a lot of institutions are struggling, which is, okay, what's that conversion step? And guess what? I would argue that how I would approach that for a 17-year-old, you know what I mean, or an 18-year-old is very different than I would for a continuing education person.
Absolutely. Well, we're a little bit more actually almost, wrapping here, a lot more, way in than just halfway in, where I normally pause for what I'd like to call station identification. So I'm going to pause here for that and say that if you are joining the YouTube premiere and you have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. Our team is live in the chat to answer any questions that you may have. Otherwise, you have joined a ScaledOn session. They are monthly sessions that we like to host covering hot topics impacting businesses as it relates to marketing, AI visibility, paid advertising, SEO, Amazon, all the things that you could think of related to marketing. We're here to help. If you have questions related to what we're talking about today or about something else entirely, please do reach out to us at scaledon.com. We offer a free opportunity review where we will take a look at whatever channels you'd like us to and come back with where we think that you could be missing opportunities in your marketing for those channels. Specifically today, we're talking about AI visibility for continuing ed and higher ed institutions. And we have a specific tool, free as well, available to you to help measure your AI enrollment visibility. We call it the AI Enrollment Visibility Snapshot. The link to that will be available at the conclusion of this video. If for some reason you miss it and you're like, hey, that sounds good, but I can't remember where to get it, you can reach out to us on scaledon.com and we'll make sure to get that over to you right away. Otherwise, join us for the next session as well. We're always going to be talking about good things. So make sure you're subscribing here on YouTube. Drop us a like on social so that you can catch up on all the good details that we have. Gentlemen, in the remaining minutes that we have here, I think we've talked about a lot of different things. And I think that the one thing that always comes to mind to me when we talk about anything related to AI, because it is new and changing so rapidly, is that it can be intimidating and overwhelming. So what would you say for, a school that wants to take this seriously? Like, what does owning that look like? Like, what are some of the things that you would hone in as starting points? And then I think the other point with that is, how often should schools be looking at this and revisiting these things, so that they're staying ahead of the AI, the rapidly evolving AI curve?
Yeah, so I think I'd like to, talk about that from two perspectives. So the first side is I don't think that you have a choice but to deal with this, and that's because your Google, because they're in this battle for their life, is reducing the amount of traffic that they're sending you. Right? We've seen some people down as much as 60%, right? In terms of like the raw clicks or traffic that they're getting, because Google is now showing up an AI overview where, guess what? They've summarized your course. They've summarized your institution against it. And so that means that if you want to continue to have the impact that your institution would like to have, you're going to need to spread out to these other platforms. And I think there's a lot of institutions who have their heads in the proverbial sand on this, where guess what? Maybe they haven't been as impacted, but this combination of this demographic trough and this major technology change, I think it will benefit the institutions that get ahead of this. You know what I mean? Are going to be in a much better place. Nobody has the perfect playbook developed, right? Because the technology is changing so quickly. So, back to our philosophy is eat the elephant in small pieces. You got to do a lot of testing, right? There, if someone comes to you and says, "Hey, we've got this all figured out," they're full of it,
Yep.
right? No one has it all figured out. Like what we're all doing is we're testing and iterating in a disciplined way and saying, hey, is that turning into more folks, enrolled? Is that turning into more courses? At the end of the day, it is those business metrics that matter. And a lot of this other stuff is noise. And, you really want to be sitting down. And unfortunately, many academic calendars, are yearly in nature, right? Just, the way things are set up. And so, Courtney, to, specifically answer your question, I would be looking at this quarterly, right? I would be benchmarking this quarterly. I think monthly doesn't make sense. You know what I mean? For most academic and continuing education programs, I would look at this quarterly and I would be looking at the trends. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I would also like to add that, in higher education and in continuing education, things are typically a bit harder because to Alec's point, it takes more time to take a decision, to take when it comes down to a business decision, actually. So I would make it a bit less intimidating by starting with a few programs first. So your higher, most important programs, start with those, optimize those, see how you show up for those, and then move on with what you learn and with the data set that you are going to uncover from those.
Absolutely. Well, look, I think that is a great place for us to put a pin in the conversation for today. There's always more to discuss when it comes to AI visibility specific to educational institutions and otherwise. So we will be back with more in the future. But for today, we would say thank you guys both for joining me with the wisdom and the time. I appreciate it. Time's a precious commodity. And thank you for everyone who's taking the time to watch today's video. If we can be of further assistance, again, reach out to us on ScaledOn.com. Otherwise, we hope to see you at the next ScaledOn session. Thanks, team.
See you there.